Have you ever seen a winter story where a grandmother in a wheelchair and a retired rescue dog became the unexpected heroes of an entire town? Tonight, you will witness how a 10-year-old German shepherd sensed danger before any human noticed, how silence revealed secrets, and how one family stood against a hidden force trying to take everything from them. As we begin, tell us in the comments where you are watching from. And if you want more real heart stories of courage, loyalty, and hope, please hit subscribe and support our YouTube channel. The town of Silverbrook lay beneath a hush of early winter, its rooftops softened by snow and its narrow streets glowing amber beneath wrought iron street lamps. The air carried a dry cold, the kind that whispers against exposed skin rather than stings, and the night sky held faint gray clouds drifting like half-forgotten dreams. In a modest brick house on a quiet corner, Elizabeth Rowan sat in her wheelchair near the frosted window, observing the snowfall with the dignity of someone who had learned long ago that silence is not emptiness, but memory. Elizabeth was 73, with hair that seemed woven from winter mist and eyes that carried a weary clarity. She had been tall in her youth and still held herself with straight-backed poise. Once a school librarian for decades, she had nurtured generations of children in Silverbrook, her strictness softened by kindness. Losing her husband 15 years earlier to heart failure had carved a quiet hollow inside her. That loss was not violent, but it had settled into her bones, shaping her into a woman both gentle and guarded, with a voice barely above a whisper, yet firm enough to halt nonsense. Beside her rested Argus, her 10-year-old German shepherd. Though age had dusted his muzzle with pale gray and stiffened his joints slightly, his posture remained vigilant. Argus had a sturdy build with a broad chest and thick winter coat of deep sable, and an intelligent amber gaze that moved with quiet calculation. He had once been a search and rescue K-9, working with a military adjunct unit in the Alaskan wilderness. Not as a combat dog, but as a rescuer of avalanche victims and lost hikers. Witnessing human distress had sharpened both his instincts and his empathy. After retirement, Argus had been placed for adoption. Elizabeth, following a chance meeting at a local veterans fundraiser, had offered him a home. The two had grown into a bond resembling an elderly queen and her loyal knight, dignified, wordless, unshakable. Across town, unseen for the moment, a young man trudged through the snow toward Elizabeth's home. Caleb Rowan, 27 years old, walked without gloves, stuffing red-fingered hands into the pockets of a worn leather jacket. Caleb was lanky, slightly underfed, with a troubled face that had once been bright with promise. He had inherited Elizabeth's sharp eyes, but where hers held wisdom, his held panic and fatigue. Caleb had been a cheerful child, quick to laugh, quick to trust. But after graduating high school, he had drifted through unstable jobs, fallen into reckless investments, and eventually slid into debt. The guilt of disappointing his grandmother gnawed at him. He now moved with the uncertain gait of someone carrying invisible chains. As he approached the doorstep, Argus lifted his head first, ears angled, nostrils widening. Elizabeth looked to the door, sensing the shift in the air. Caleb stepped inside after only a soft knock, letting in a swirl of snow-laced wind. Elizabeth's gaze examined him, not judging, but noticing every detail. "You've been gone a while," she said calmly. Caleb tried to smile, but managed only a weak twitch of his lips. Things got complicated. Argus approached him slowly, not with hostility, but with the solemn curiosity of an old soldier meeting a younger one. Caleb scratched him gently behind the ear, though his shaking hands betrayed his anxiety. A small movement outside drew Argus's attention back to the window. Across the street, partially obscured by the snowfall, stood Jack Mercer, a local officer with the Silverbrook Police Department. Jack was 34, with a sturdy athletic frame, short dark hair, and a face marked by both calmness and alertness. As a K-9 officer, Jack was perceptive in ways that transcended mere training. He had worked with police dogs for years, though his current partner, a younger German shepherd, was resting on duty tonight. Jack had a reputation for fairness, patience, and empathy, especially toward the elderly and the vulnerable. He had grown up in Silverbrook, in a blue-collar family, and had once nearly left town after a failed engagement with a woman who had mistrusted his dedication to work. That heartbreak had changed him, leaving a subtle melancholy beneath his steady professionalism. He had returned to the K9 division because dogs, unlike people, never lied. From the street, Jack watched Caleb entering the house. He had not been called there. He was simply performing an unofficial winter welfare check. Many seniors struggled during cold months, and Jack had made it a habit to casually pass by Elizabeth's house. He respected her, the old librarian who had once shushed him in third grade, then slipped him an extra bookmark in apology. Elizabeth noticed Jack in the snow and gave him a slow nod, not summoning him, but acknowledging his presence. Jack nodded back and remained at his distance. Inside, Caleb removed his jacket and breathed heavily. "Grandma, I need a little time, and I need your trust." Elizabeth turned her wheelchair slightly. "Caleb, you're frozen. Sit. Warm up." She didn't interrogate him, not yet. The fire crackled softly in the cast-iron stove. Argus lay down near Elizabeth, but his eyes remained fixed on Caleb. Slowly, conversation thawed the frost between them. Caleb spoke of vague troubles, unfinished business, people he owed. His tone wavered between pleading and shame. Elizabeth listened, absorbing every word like snow absorbs footsteps. "You're not a bad person," she finally said, "but you've made bad deals." Caleb lowered his head. "I didn't know how to fix them." Outside, Jack's boots crunched on the snow as he returned to his patrol car, parked nearby. But before leaving, he paused, watching Argus through the window. The dog stared back, a long, steady gaze of recognition. Jack whispered under his breath, barely audible even to himself, "I know those eyes." That remembered look, the watchfulness of a dog who had seen human desperation in the cold, connected something in Jack's memory. He wondered what had brought Argus out of retirement and how Elizabeth came to have him. Evening deepened, turning the snowfall heavier. The wind's lullaby became a low, warning hum. Caleb eventually rose to leave, promising he'd return tomorrow to talk more. Elizabeth merely said, "I'll be here." Argus walked him to the door, slow, measured, escorting rather than banishing. Jack, inside his car, watched Caleb depart through the blur of falling snow and a frost-smeared windshield. He didn't interfere, not yet. In the quiet that followed, Elizabeth pressed her palm gently onto Argus's head. "He's lost," she murmured. Argus leaned into the touch, sighing through his nose like an old guardian resigned to more nights of watchfulness. The wind moved along Silverbrook's streets, swaying the street lamps. Without knowing it, each of the three souls, the winter woman, her veteran dog, and the observant officer, stood at the threshold of something far larger than personal salvation or personal ruin. For now, there were only falling snowflakes, gathering, softening, concealing. But beneath them, a storm bided its time. The next several days in Silverbrook unfolded beneath an unbroken quilt of pale snowfall, as though winter itself wished to protect, or conceal, the story playing out behind closed doors. Elizabeth Rowan's home stood as a beacon of warm lamplight against the hush of white, and each evening the silhouette of Argus appeared in the front window, watching the street like a seasoned sentry. Caleb Rowan returned almost daily. Each time he arrived, his posture seemed a little more collapsed, his confidence more threadbare, his smile more fragile. On the third visit, he brought with him the tremble of desperation rather than the cold of the weather. He stood before his grandmother with hands clenched in the pockets of his jacket, the same battered leather one, with stitching worn and shoulders frayed, and his eyes glistened with the anxious sheen of someone backed into a corner. "Grandma," he began, tightly restrained but fraying at the seams, "I need you to sign the house over, temporarily, just for a short time. I promise I'll reverse it." Elizabeth did not reply immediately. She studied him, every blink, every fidget, every twitch beneath his skin. She was a master of silence, and silence was often more revealing than interrogation. Argus stepped between them, not aggressively, not confrontationally, but merely to exist as a breathing barrier. The German shepherd had a subtle language of his own. The tilt of the head, the narrowing of the eye, the dynamic stillness of a creature always evaluating human intent. Caleb raised his hands slowly, palms outward, as though reassuring a negotiator. I'm not trying to trick you, Argus. I promise. Elizabeth's voice, when it finally arrived, was gentle but firm with the wisdom of winters past. Caleb, I will not sign anything I do not fully understand. You must tell me why. The young man exhaled, defeated, sinking into the nearest armchair as though gravity had doubled. It's North Star Capital, he murmured. They loaned me money, a lot. More than I should have asked for. I thought I could flip it. I thought I could make it back. I didn't realize what I was really signing. Elizabeth's expression softened but did not melt. Argus remained close to her wheelchair, gazing at Caleb with something between caution and sympathy. The next day, as the snow deepened and the town seemed to hunker beneath it, Jack Mercer appeared at Elizabeth's door under the guise of routine winter welfare checks. He knocked lightly, stamped the snow from his boots, and greeted her with a respectful nod. "Evening, Ms. Rowan. Just making sure your heat's flowing and pipes aren't freezing." Jack's tone carried the half-joking warmth of someone who disguised concern with professionalism. But there was another reason he had come, one less official. Argus trotted over and greeted him, not with exuberance but with a solemn recognition. Jack knelt, resting a hand lightly against the thick winter coat of the aging K9. "You've been restless, haven't you, old boy?" he murmured. Elizabeth found herself watching the exchange with quiet curiosity. "He's been more alert than usual," she remarked. "He hardly sleeps, and he stays near the door like he's waiting for someone or something." Jack glanced at her, then back at Argus, as though deciphering a code. "Sometimes," he said thoughtfully, "they sense trouble before humans see it." Caleb was not present that evening, but Elizabeth confided in Jack the essentials, not to betray Caleb, but out of instinct. She spoke of the debt, the request to temporarily sign ownership, and the shadow of North Star Capital looming behind it. Jack listened with the silence of a man who gathered information like a hunter reading faint tracks in snow. "We've seen that company," he finally said. "Not in open charges, but whispers. They operate carefully, just under the threshold of prosecutable behavior." Elizabeth's lips tightened. "Legal predators," she said softly. "Yes," Jack agreed. "They leave no tooth marks, but something worse." On the fourth day, Caleb arrived again, this time looking less like a petitioner and more like someone cornered by unseen forces. "They're coming," he muttered, pacing like a trapped fox. "They want collateral. They don't care about fairness. They just want possession." Elizabeth reached out, placing a calm hand over his trembling one. "Caleb, look at me." He forced himself to meet her gaze. "You came here because you still believe you're worth saving, so I will help you, but I will not do it by surrendering my home to thieves." Argus emitted a small exhale, almost a sigh, almost a growl, as though affirming her words. Caleb wiped his face with both hands, frustration and shame mingling in his expression. "I never meant to drag you into this." "It is not too late," Elizabeth said. "We fight the right way, with daylight, not darkness." A moment later came a soft knock at the door. Argus bristled immediately, rising from his resting position. Outside stood Jack Mercer, cheeks reddened by the cold, snow clinging to his dark police uniform. But this time, he wasn't merely visiting. "I'd like to speak with Caleb," he said gently, though his tone carried a firm undercurrent. The young man stiffened but nodded, and the two stepped aside into the parlor. Jack's voice lowered. "Look, I'm not here to accuse you. I'm here because I think there's more going on than simple debt." Caleb's eyes flickered with uncertainty. "They're watching me," he whispered. "I don't know how, I don't know where, but they're watching everything." Argus paced slowly across the parlor, sniffing the edges, nose working the air like a practiced investigator. Jack followed the dog's motion, his brows pulling together. "He knows something," Jack said softly. Elizabeth watched, tension and curiosity interwoven. Argus paused at the base of the old walnut hallway cabinet. He sniffed, then looked at Jack. Not a random look, a pointed one. Jack knelt, running fingers across the underside of the molding. There. He found a tiny lens, discreet, barely the size of a pepper seed, affixed with industrial adhesive, a micro camera. Elizabeth's breath caught. Caleb paled. "They've bugged the house." Jack removed the device carefully, handling it like fragile evidence. "Not just this house, I bet," he muttered. "They want leverage. They want fear." Elizabeth closed her eyes, shaken not by violation of privacy, but violation of dignity. Argus sat beside her, pressing gently against her leg. A silent vow. The discovery changed everything. Jack straightened, meeting Caleb's gaze squarely. "Don't ask her for signatures again," he said. "Ask for protection, ask for cooperation, but don't ask her to sacrifice the roof over her head." Caleb's voice broke. I understand." Jack exhaled, then approached Elizabeth. "I'm filing a report. I'll need to return with authorization to inspect the premises more thoroughly. I'll treat this with discretion." Elizabeth nodded calmly. "Do what you must." Argus licked Jack's hand once, not a gesture of joy, but of solemn approval. Outside, the snowfall thickened, flakes swirling in patterns almost deliberate, as though the storm wished to veil the street from prying eyes. Jack left, stepping into the night with steady resolve. Caleb remained behind, silent beside the fire, staring into the embers. He had crossed the threshold from secrecy into exposure. There was no going back. Elizabeth rolled closer, placing a hand lightly on his shoulder. "We will face what comes, in daylight, together." Argus lay down at their feet, a guardian who had already chosen his side, and thus beneath the muffled hush of winter, the first quiet movement of resistance stirred, not with violence, but with truth. The storm arrived without thunder, only with a suffocating quiet that wrapped around Silverbrook like damp wool. By nightfall, the town lay beneath a sky stubbornly refusing to clear, and the snow pressed down in thicker, heavier veils than before. Inside Elizabeth Rowan's house, a hush lingered after dinner. Caleb sat with restless energy in the parlor, the firelight painting sharp shadows across his face, revealing the gilt lines etched beneath his eyes. Elizabeth, ever perceptive, had noticed his agitation even before he spoke. His breathing was shallow, his foot tapped unconsciously against the floor, and his gaze repeatedly flicked toward the window as though expecting something. Or someone. Argus lay near the front door, head resting between his paws, but his ears kept twitching, first to the left, then to the right, the canine version of heightened alertness. And then it happened. Caleb suddenly stood, as though shoved forward by a gust of invisible wind. "They're here," he whispered, voice frayed at the edges. "They're coming tonight. They won't wait any longer." Elizabeth's pulse quickened, but her voice remained composed. "Who, Caleb?" His answer was barely audible. "The collectors." And right then, as if summoned by the confession, a deep bass rumble slid through the silent street. The headlights of a dark SUV appeared like twin predatory eyes cutting through the snowfall, pulling up to the curb without haste, as though confident of its purpose. Argus sprang to his feet, issuing a low, controlled rumble from deep inside his chest. Not a bark, just a warning note. Caleb went pale. "That's them." The vehicle door opened. Two men emerged, not rugged thugs lunging with baseball bats. No. These men wore dark wool coats, gloves, neatly pressed trousers. The professionalism of their attire was almost worse. It suggested legitimacy, or at least the performance of legitimacy. The first man was broad-shouldered with a square jaw and salt and pepper hair slicked backward. The second was slimmer, shorter, with glasses faintly fogging from the cold air. They looked like bankers, but their expressions carried the quiet threat of men who never needed to raise their voices. Argus pushed forward, positioning himself between Elizabeth and the door. Elizabeth wheeled herself slightly backward, not out of fear, but to give Argus the space he claimed. Caleb swallowed hard and opened the door only a crack. The broad man spoke first, voice smooth, almost pleasant. "Good evening. We're here on behalf of North Star Capital." Caleb stepped out onto the porch, closing the door behind him, but only partially. Argus kept one amber eye fixed on him through the gap. "I told you I'm working on it," Caleb said. The man raised an eyebrow. "Time has expired. Unfortunately, repayment now must be completed through asset transfer." His partner produced folded documents and extended them with gloved hands. "We'll need the primary resident to sign, the signature of Ms. Rowan." Caleb shook his head, adrenaline fighting remorse. No, she won't sign anything." The slim man's tone shifted slightly, not louder, but harder. "Then your situation becomes Complicated. Caleb bristled. She's an elderly woman. This is illegal. The broad man gave a courteous smile, the kind that felt like ice on skin. Illegal? No. Opportunistic? Perhaps. But she agreed when you placed the property as pending collateral. The words sank into Caleb like knives. From inside, Argus emitted a decisive bark, loud, assertive, not aggressive, but commanding attention. In that same moment, headlights flickered at the far corner of the street. A police cruiser approached slowly. Caleb blinked. No way. But yes. As the cruiser neared, the passenger door suddenly rattled. Not because someone opened it, but because something was banging against the interior, a frantic thumping, a desperate alarm. Then, the door burst open and Argus leapt out, sending a spray of snow behind him. Elizabeth had allowed him to exit because she understood him. Argus had demanded to be let out. Jack Mercer emerged from the driver's side, looking startled yet instantly alert. Easy! Argus! But Argus wasn't attacking. He was intercepting. He positioned himself between the two collectors and Caleb with rigid authority. Jack approached, eyes flicking from the men to Caleb to Argus. Evening, he began, tone cold and professional. Care to tell me the purpose of this visit? The broad man smiled again, falsely cordial. Debt collection officer, legal documentation. Jack extended a hand. Let's see it. The slim man hesitated, but handed over the papers. Jack scanned them, his brow furrowing almost immediately. These aren't notarized, and these registry codes don't match municipal property records. He looked up sharply. These are invalid. The broad man's smile vanished. Officer, you are not a financial attorney? No, Jack interrupted. I'm a sworn protector of citizens, and this looks like attempted property seizure through fraudulent documentation. Caleb let out a shaky breath. Relief and terror tangled. The collectors stiffened, recalculating. The broad man spoke again, but this time the smoothness was gone. We will return, with actual attorneys. Jack didn't break eye contact. You do that, and bring documents that don't crumble under scrutiny. Snow gusted between them, as though nature itself wished to push the men away. After a taut moment, the two collectors returned to their SUV. The engine rumbled and then the vehicle drove off into the swirling drifts, swallowed by the winter shadows. Caleb sagged against the porch railing, exhaling hard. I thought it was over. Jack placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. It's not over, but tonight you earned a second chance by not folding. Argus approached Caleb, nose pressing firmly against his leg, not affectionate, but grounding. Elizabeth rolled forward to the doorway, eyes keen but gentle. She spoke quietly. I told you, we face things with daylight. The adrenaline slowly ebbed, leaving only exhaustion, but exhaustion laced with something unfamiliar to Caleb, hope. Jack walked them back into the house, closing the door against the winter night. Inside, the fire crackled softly again, as though resuming its measured breathing. Caleb sank into the armchair. Argus lay near his feet, and Elizabeth placed a comforting hand upon Argus's head. Jack stood by the window for a long moment, watching the street. They'll try again, he murmured, but now we're watching too. Outside, snowfall waltzed through the lamplight, soft, endless, implacable. Something had shifted. No longer was the Rowan house merely a residency. It had become a defensive line, and in the heart of it stood not just an elderly woman and her troubled grandson, but the quiet alliance of truth, law, and loyalty. And the winter, though bitter, now felt less suffocating, and more like a test. Winter did not relent in the days that followed. Instead, it sharpened its claws. The sky turned a bluer shade of iron. The snowbanks rose like white barricades along the sidewalks of Silverbrook, and even the chimneys puffed smoke as though exhaling worry. Inside Elizabeth Rowan's home, however, the atmosphere shifted, not with fear, but with a sober resolve. Caleb Rowan had changed. He was no longer the twitching, desperate young man with haunted eyes. There was still dread, yes, but beneath it now ran a current of confession, accountability, and a quiet surrender to truth. He had spent the last night barely sleeping, pacing between his memories and his guilt. When morning came, he sat at the kitchen table, the same table Elizabeth had used for decades to serve cocoa to children and tea to neighbors, and finally let his guard collapse. Elizabeth listened, sitting across from him, with Argus lying loyally by her side. Sunlight seeped through the frost-hazed window, illuminating Caleb's face. He had the look of a man standing before judgment, but offering his own testimony. "I need to tell you everything," he murmured. Elizabeth nodded gently. "Yes, you do." Caleb inhaled, a long, shaking breath, and began. He explained how the debts had begun, first small, then quickly steep. North Star Capital had lured him with friendly emails and assuring voices on the phone. They had promised risk-free advancement and short-term liquidity. They had praised his potential. They had flattered his ambition. He signed the agreements thinking he understood numbers. He did not understand predators. They didn't demand repayment when he failed to profit, not at first. Instead, they suggested a temporary collateral addendum. He accepted. He thought it was a mere formality. That document, which he signed electronically in a moment of panic, had effectively listed Elizabeth's home as callable collateral. "I didn't mean to risk your house," Caleb whispered, pressing palms against his face. "I swear, I just thought it was procedural. I thought nothing would come of it." Elizabeth did not scold him, nor did she diminish his remorse with sympathy. She spoke slowly, her voice quiet but unyielding. "When your grandfather died, I made a promise," she said, "that our home would remain a place of safety, a refuge, even when the world outside may not be." Argus nudged her hand with his snout, as though confirming that truth. Caleb felt the weight of the promise, and how close he had come to shattering it. Later that day, Jack Mercer returned, this time with purpose rather than courtesy check. He wore his standard uniform, but carried an additional layer of investigative authority that seemed almost visible around him, a folder in one hand and a radio clipped more prominently on his vest. Jack was a man good at reading rooms. When he entered the kitchen and saw Caleb sitting upright, not defensive, not evasive, but present, he recognized a shifting tide. Argus approached Jack and greeted him with a slow wag of the tail, dignified, respectful, a soldier acknowledging another. Jack spoke plainly. "I filed the report. Technically, we need a warrant to inspect the premises for more surveillance devices. But given that the initial one was hidden with malicious intent, obtaining authorization will be easy." Elizabeth nodded. "Whatever is necessary." Jack looked at Caleb, reading the shame and resolve in his posture. "You're cooperating. That matters." Caleb looked up, surprised. "Does it?" "Very much," Jack replied. Then he turned to Argus. "And where do we look next, old boy?" Argus sniffed the air, not dramatically like in films, but with the steady, methodical scent analysis of a dog trained for detection. He began to move, first through the kitchen, then down the creaking stairs to the basement. Jack followed. Elizabeth watched from above. Caleb trailed behind. The basement of the Rowan home was a repository of decades: wooden crates, faded furniture covers, boxes labeled in Elizabeth's careful handwriting. And yet, Argus ignored all of that. He prowled slowly, nose tracing the edges of the room, until he paused near the old water heater. His ears perked, his nose pressed against the back wall, a panel of plain wood that blended into the structure so well it seemed featureless. Jack moved to inspect it. There, barely visible without close inspection, lay a hairline seam. A human eye might have overlooked it for months, years even. But Argus did not miss such things. Jack knelt, tugged at the edge, and with a soft crack of loosening adhesive, the panel came free. Behind it was not a safe, but a small mounted camera, identical to the first one, surrounded by a tiny relay box attached to microwiring. It was transmitting wirelessly. Jack's jaw tensed. They installed this months ago. Caleb stared, horror dawning. They were watching me before I even knew I was in trouble. Elizabeth's spine straightened, and her voice cooled like a blade. They were never interested in you. They wanted the house. Jack disconnected the camera, sealed it into an evidence bag, and photographed everything with procedural precision. He spoke with clarity now, official clarity. "This level of intrusion is criminal. They're not merely debt collectors. They're operating an illegal property acquisition system. Caleb shook his head. But what can we do? They're big, they're connected. Jack met his eyes. Not anymore. They just crossed into felony territory. They went back upstairs. Elizabeth made tea, because even in the unfolding of criminal revelation, warmth is sometimes needed in a cup. The kitchen filled with steam and the scent of chamomile. Jack laid out the plan. We track the camera's origin through the relay ID. That leads to the vendor. The vendor logs device purchases. That leads to the corporate buyer. And from there, the data opens like a map. Caleb listened, absorbing not just the words, but the structure of justice. Argus lay by the hearth, finally relaxing. Job done for now. Elizabeth reached down and stroked the graying fur between his ears. Good boy, she whispered. Argus closed his eyes halfway, leaning into the touch. Jack stepped forward and gently rested a hand on Argus's neck as well. Companions in vigilance. He's done half the investigative work for me, Jack said with a faint smile. Caleb looked at Argus, truly looked at him, with new understanding. He saved us, Elizabeth corrected softly. He defended what matters. Later, as evening cast its indigo hue over the town and streetlights glowed like golden orbs floating in the snow-thick night, Elizabeth drew Caleb aside. She took his hand and spoke not as a grandmother scolding a boy, but as a woman speaking to a man. You made mistakes, she said, but running from them brought you here. I don't think that was a coincidence. Caleb swallowed. I'm trying to be better. Then be better now, she replied. Not someday. Jack looked back at them before leaving. I'll return soon, next time with authorization, and possibly with federal interest. This is bigger than Silverbrook now. And then Argus did something small, but meaningful. He walked to Caleb, paused, and rested his head lightly against Caleb's knee. Not full affection, not total trust, but permission to try again. Caleb's eyes stung with unshed tears. He placed a trembling hand upon Argus's head. Thank you, he whispered. When Jack left and the door closed behind him, the winter night pressed gently against the house. Inside, there was tension. Yes, but also unity. A shift. A turning point. Somewhere in town, in some polished corporate office or rented room, people sat and waited for results that were no longer guaranteed. And inside the Rowan home, a different kind of waiting began. One strengthened by truth, loyalty, and the quiet courage carried by those who refused to surrender. Outside, the wind brushed over Silverbrook like a messenger, and the snow kept falling. Winter loosened its grip slowly, like a hesitant ruler relinquishing command. The snows of January had begun to recede by inches, revealing salted pavement beneath, yet the air still held the sting of cold breath. 8 weeks had passed since the night of the fraudulent collectors, 8 weeks since the discovery of the hidden cameras, and in those 8 weeks, the narrative of Silverbrook had shifted from private turmoil to public revelation. In this time, Caleb Rowan had transformed. Gone was the shadowed young man furtively glancing over his shoulder. In his place now stood someone tempered by transparency, quieter but sturdier. He spent those weeks assisting Elizabeth rowing firewood from the shed, repairing loose shutters battered by wind, fixing porch steps with frozen fingers, and walking Argus through the snowy mornings. Each action was small, humble, but sincerity had begun to germinate in those footprints pressed in snow. Argus's trust did not return overnight. At first, he merely tolerated Caleb. Then, gradually, he accepted him in proximity. Eventually, he permitted him to brush the thick winter coat that shed tufts of fur like winter clouds falling apart. This was how forgiveness truly worked, not in proclamations, but in increments. Jack Mercer visited often during those 8 weeks, but now his visits were not just professional obligations. They were the visits of a man who had placed himself between the Rowan household and the approaching legal storm. He met with prosecutors, gathered digital forensic evidence, coordinated with state investigators, and assembled a portfolio of indisputable violations by North Star Capital. The investigation revealed far more than expected. The surveillance was not limited to Elizabeth's home. 6 other elderly residents in Silverbrook had been similarly targeted. 2 had been pressured into early eviction threats. One had survived a stroke during the litigation threat. The pattern became clear. Target the vulnerable, exploit their trust, extract property, sit on assets, disguise theft behind legality. Elizabeth, once a quiet figure in her wheelchair, became a symbolic anchor in the case. Her calm, dignity, and clarity of recollection proved invaluable. She remembered the wording of phone calls, dates of documents, names of representatives. She carried facts like beads on a rosary and spoke them without trembling. Caleb, meanwhile, agreed to testify, not as a victim, but as a witness who had participated unknowingly in the pipeline of exploitation. His guilt became strength when redirected into accountability. Jack had told him one evening near the fireplace, "Being part of the harm means you can be part of the solution." Caleb had repeated those words to himself for days. And so, the day arrived, late winter, the skies pale and exhausted, the courthouse steps cleared of ice for public safety. Citizens of Silverbrook came bundled in scarves and knitted hats. Elizabeth wore a wool coat over her lap and a plaid blanket across her legs. Argus walked beside her, wearing a simple working harness, not as a K-9 officer, but as an emotional sentinel. Jack walked on her other side, carrying documents and a thermos of hot coffee. In the courtroom, the heat from radiators warmed the air, but could not thaw the emotional tension. North Star Capital's legal team sat on one side, 3 polished attorneys with briefcases and glossy hair. The CEO himself, Douglas Harlow, a graying man in a fur-lined coat, sat with an air of irritation rather than remorse. He had the confidence of someone accustomed to winning. On the opposing side sat Jack, Elizabeth, Caleb, and the state prosecutor. A composed black woman named Marlene Chambers, age 46, with a steady voice and a reputation for integrity. She wore simple professional attire, hair pulled back tightly, and spoke with measured control. She had become deeply invested in this case, not only because of its legal significance, but because of what it represented, a battle between predation and principle. The judge presiding was Herbert Dalka, age 62, lean and somewhat stoic, known for his aversion to theatrics and his respect for evidence. He adjusted his spectacles and opened the proceedings. Jack presented the chain of discovery, photographs of the hidden cameras, relay device logs, purchase records tracing each unit to North Star Capital, audio recordings of collectors applying psychological pressure, extracted data from digital correspondence suggesting intentional manipulation of elderly property owners. Then Elizabeth was called to the stand. Her hands rested calmly on the armrests of her wheelchair. Her voice was soft, but echoed in that quiet room with surprising resonance. She described how the calls began, the friendly tone of salesmanship, the suggestion of temporary safeguards, the assurances, oh, the assurances, that never held truth. She did not speak with bitterness or dramatic emotion. She spoke with clarity, and clarity is devastating when laid against deception. Then came Caleb's testimony. He stood tall, though visibly nervous, and admitted his mistake. His words were raw. "I thought I was being helped, but I was being used. I didn't know what I had signed until Jack showed me the camera. That's when I realized they weren't protecting me. They were observing us." His honesty moved something human in the room. Even Judge Dalka's eyes softened momentarily. When all testimonies had been heard, the attorneys for North Star Capital attempted to pivot. They argued procedural misunderstanding. They argued technical compliance. They argued legal semantics. But their arguments fell like flimsy branches against a firm wind. Marlene Chambers rose and delivered the closing argument like a measured storm. "This," she said, "is not about numbers. It is about people. It is about trust. It is about the ethical responsibility not to weaponize vulnerability." Argus, lying beside Elizabeth, seemed to sense the moment, raising his head, watching silently. Then the judge spoke, and his ruling arrived like decisive winter thunder. North Star Capital was found guilty of fraudulent exploitation. Their false claims were voided. Their hidden surveillance was deemed criminal misconduct. Their assets related to targeted home acquisitions were frozen pending restitution. Caleb received a suspended sentence, formally recognized for cooperation and essential witness testimony. Elizabeth retained full ownership of her home and was acknowledged as a primary harmed party, due fair compensation from the seizure of the company's funds. The courtroom exhaled collectively. Elizabeth closed her eyes briefly, not in triumph, but in relief. Caleb sat beside her, head bowed, shoulders trembling. Jack squeezed Elizabeth's shoulder, gently. "It's done," he whispered. Argus rested his chin on Elizabeth's knee. Outside, when they finally exited the courthouse, the sun, pale and cool, broke through the thinning clouds. Snow still rested on rooftops, but now the light reached through it. It was not warmth yet, not spring, but a promise of it. And in that promise, they stood together, no longer trapped by winter, but moving toward its end. Spring did not arrive all at once. It came as a quiet negotiation with winter, a slow thawing rather than a sudden surrender. In Silverbrook, patches of green began to break through beneath dwindling snowbanks. The river thawed in thin ribbons of water, and robins returned like scouts daring to test whether the season had turned. Elizabeth Rowan felt the change in her bones. It was not simply a shift of climate, but a shift of spirit. The house that had once carried the tension of uncertainty now carried the soft hum of restoration. Caleb Rowan had taken to repairing more than just the physical structure of the home. He fixed the broken banister on the staircase, replaced worn window frames, repainted the porch railing, and resecured the fence posts. He worked with sleeves rolled up, arms dusted with sawdust and sweat, and sometimes grease from old nails. He rarely spoke while he worked, but his silence had changed. It was not tight with anxiety anymore, but steady with purpose. His back straightened, his movements grew sure. He was no longer a boy trying to outrun mistakes, but a man trying to amend them. Argus watched him always. The German shepherd would rest nearby as Caleb worked outdoors, lying in the grass like a retired watchman who had earned the right to relax, yet still kept one ear tuned to activity. At first, Argus simply observed. Then, gradually, he began to follow Caleb on walks around the yard. Eventually, the distance between them closed. Caleb would crouch and hold out a hand. Argus would lean forward to receive it. In this unspoken language, forgiveness was being granted not freely, but fairly. Jack Mercer visited often, though now without a badge's urgency. Sometimes he came in uniform, sometimes in a casual jacket, but always he arrived with an easy step and a warm simplicity, as though the Rowan house had become a second home of sorts. When Elizabeth greeted him at the door, it was no longer formal or official. It was almost familial. One warm afternoon, or warm by Silverbrook standards, Jack arrived carrying a bundle of paperwork tucked beneath one arm. Elizabeth sat outside under the porch roof, enjoying the mild air. Argus lay beside her, eyes half closed, soaking in the emerging sunlight. Caleb was on a ladder, tightening a hinge on a shutter. Jack approached and spoke lightly. "You keep this up, and you'll have remodeled the entire house by summer." Caleb grinned, a real one this time, unburdened, and replied, "That's the idea." Elizabeth smiled at the exchange. It felt like a life restored. Later, when Caleb went inside to wash up, Jack remained with Elizabeth. He leaned against the porch railing and spoke quietly. "I wanted you to know, Ms. Rowan, we were successful. A statewide review has begun into aggressive lending practices. North Star was just the first domino." Elizabeth nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "Sometimes one act of courage is all that's needed to start a reckoning." Jack chuckled softly. "If anyone was courageous, it was you, and Argus." At his name, Argus lifted his head slowly, tail brushing the porch boards with a soft tap-tap. Elizabeth rested a hand on the old dog's neck. "He's seen too much in life to ignore injustice." Jack's gaze softened. "I know that look. I saw dogs like him in Alaska during training exchanges. Dogs who had learned to read human desperation and act on it." When Caleb returned, they spent the afternoon talking lightly about small things: weather, repairs, neighbors, the ordinary details of ordinary peace. And that perhaps was the true victory, the return of normalcy. A few days later, Silverbrook held a community gathering, an informal one, outside the local town hall. The mayor, an elderly man with a snowy mustache named Victor Ramsey, gave a short speech thanking the police, the state attorney's office, and the citizens. But then, unexpectedly, he turned toward Elizabeth. And particularly, he said, to Ms. Rowan, who refused to be intimidated, and to Argus, whose vigilance made all the difference. The crowd applauded. Elizabeth held her composure, but there was a glimmer of humbled gratitude in her eyes. A group of local residents then unveiled a small wooden sign, beautifully carved by volunteers. "Thank you, Argus, for protecting our homes and the heart of Silverbrook." Someone had even carved a tiny silhouette of a German shepherd into the corner. Argus didn't understand honors, tributes, or symbolism, but he did understand Elizabeth's gentle palm on his back and the crowd's warm attention. His ears flicked, his eyes softened. He accepted the moment with stoic dignity. After the gathering, Jack, Caleb, and Elizabeth walked home together with Argus padding alongside. The sky was lavender with evening. Caleb broke the silence first. "I can't believe there's a sign for him." Jack laughed. "He earned it." Elizabeth echoed softly. "He did." When they reached the house, Caleb went inside to prepare tea. Jack lingered at the steps. Elizabeth remained beside Argus, who stood beside her like a sentinel waiting for nightfall's first star. Elizabeth looked at Jack and said in a quiet, teasing tone, "You know, if Argus accepts you, I suppose I must as well." Jack's smile eased into something gentler. "That's a tough endorsement to earn." Argus looked up at him, and for the first time, without uncertainty, bumped his head softly into Jack's leg. Not a request, not a duty, but a greeting, a recognition. Jack bent and scratched behind Argus's ear. "We're friends, old boy," he murmured. "I'm honored." The final snow of the season fell that night, a light, almost symbolic dusting. In the morning, it melted quickly, leaving only dew and the faint memory of winter. Weeks later, when the trees began to leaf and grass stretched into young blades of green, Elizabeth sat on the porch with a quiet thoughtfulness. She reflected not just on what had been returned, the house, the security, but what had been gained, Caleb's redemption, Jack's friendship, Argus's enduring loyalty. The winter had tested them, but it had also revealed them. She spoke aloud, though no one had asked a question. "The world tries us, but it also sends us help, even when we don't know to ask for it." Argus nestled beside her. Jack arrived shortly after with 2 cups of coffee, one for Elizabeth, one for himself, and Caleb joined them outside with a small toolkit, intending to fix the remaining loose shutter. They did not speak about debts or threats or courts. They spoke about tomorrow. They spoke about small joys. They existed in the sunlight of restoration, and somewhere overhead, where winter had once hung thick and gray, spring spread itself across Silverbrook, and the town breathed in fresh air. Argus, Elizabeth, Jack, and Caleb, each in their own way, had survived a storm, and now the storm had passed. In the quiet closing of this story, we are reminded that God's miracles do not always arrive with thunder or bright signs. Sometimes they come softly through the loyalty of a dog who refuses to give up, through the courage of a man who chooses compassion, and through the strength God places in ordinary people when they feel they have nothing left. In our everyday lives, we face storms of our own moments of loneliness, anxiety, or doubt. But God walks beside us even then. He guides our steps, protects our families, and sends help in ways we often recognize only afterward. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need encouragement. Today, leave a comment to tell us your thoughts and type Amen if you believe in the quiet miracles God sends. And please support the channel by subscribing so we can continue bringing stories of faith, hope, and love. May God bless you and your loved ones with peace, protection, and strength.